Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming to listen to us and our research that we've so painstakingly gone over these past few months. Appreciate your attendance. And for the fulfillment of my Nord 850 class, my internship presentation is on mine greenhousing, and specifically, is it feasible to put an all-year food production greenhouse at Cameco's Rabbit Lake site. So before I get into it, I'd like to thank my supervisors who are here and who can't be here. Mr. John Lancaster, we became pretty steady friends over my few visits to sites, and you were instrumental, thank you. Mr. Lindsay Blair, I didn't see where there you are. I got Lindsay a little bit later in the project, but he's been a great help to me. He replaced Ryan Gibson, who for the center went on to great things at Memorial University in Newfoundland. And then Dr. Ken Coates, and Ryan Gibson. So I guess we'll just dive right into it. So a bit of background. As I'm sure you're all aware, fresh produce is very much so more expensive in the north of the province than in the south. And these prices come from the Northern Food Basket, which was revised in 2007 to feature more northern foods. 67 foods actually, and what that is it's a basket of food that 4 people, a family of 4, would need for 2 weeks. So these prices are for every 2 weeks. You can't really see the small numbers, and I'm sorry, but in far north in the Athabasca region, for 2 weeks, they figured it out to be $394 versus you see in the large southern city $193. And this is 2011 data. So what this says is that there's over 200% or twice as much costs that go into feeding your family when you live in the far north of Saskatchewan. In addition, there are federal programs that provide for communities and families to get food more cheaply or subsidized, but only 3 Saskatchewan communities qualify for this: Black Lake, Fond du Lac, and Stony Rapids, and the subsidy that they get is actually the lowest available through the federal government. It's 5 cents per kilogram. So it doesn't do much, and it certainly doesn't do enough, as the data shows. So why Rabbit Lake? Why would we choose a uranium mine of all places to put a greenhouse? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. Well, the Rabbit Lake mine site is subarctic, meaning that it's located really far up there in the north east of the province in the Athabasca region. And if you look at the biology of it, it's actually in between 2 of the harshest ecozones, 0A and 0B, which are Arctic zones. So it's a very difficult place to grow fruit and vegetables. As such, seeing the silver lining there, it represents a worst case scenario. If we can grow vegetables at Rabbit Lake, we can grow vegetables anywhere, was the idea. In addition, the idea for the greenhouse came internally from people at the Rabbit Lake mine. And I've worked at many mines, and I have to say the people at Rabbit Lake have a lot of vigor and they're very positive, so I can see why it came from such a mine site, because they're very proactive and very green. So it was thought that would help motivate it. And lastly, it was my own personal thoughts, and I think the thoughts of others, that mine sites possess certain expertise, on-site tradespeople, and etc., that would kind of lubricate this process and maybe make it more economically feasible. Additionally, Rabbit Lake has more than 2 decades of climatological data, and when you're trying to build a greenhouse, basically what you're doing is making a microenvironment. And it's very valuable to know what you can expect to be up against on the outside. So that's another asset. So methods, what did we do? Or what did I do? Prior to visiting Rabbit Lake, I did a pretty extensive literature review. And then I went up to Rabbit Lake for 3 visits, so a total time of 13 days for on-site observation. And I did 12 interviews with people from various departments on site. And these interviews, at first, I thought they were going to be this kind of fun thing that, not that they weren't fun, that would be a small part of the project that was me showing my goodwill to the people of Rabbit Lake, that I was taking in their information. But I actually ended up learning the majority of my stuff, of my information, from other people at Rabbit Lake. You should do this, you should investigate this. So that part of the research was really entertaining. And one little piece of that I got out of those interviews was a SWOT analysis, or a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis. It's a lot of data, you don't have to read it, but the main thing is the threats. So if a greenhouse is entirely volunteer driven, it's vulnerable. If the hygiene is not strict, pathogens or pests can be easily introduced. Greenhouse fertilizer and food can attract wildlife. Full-time positions will damage the economic feasibility of any endeavor. External food testing may be required, and local food production may affect existing contracts with food suppliers. So those were the threats that we were trying to mitigate. So methods. So the next thing that I went to do, this is supposed to be a food production greenhouse, so I needed to know how much fresh produce was coming into Rapid Lake. Again, a lot of data, you don't really have to pay attention to it. The important part is this in the red, and that's pounds per shipment and total weight. And this is winter data. So what you can see, Rapid Lake, I should say, gets two of these shipments per week. So double this number, and that's in pounds. And so that'd be about 2,600. And then we move to summer shipments, and you see that it would be about 2,400. So the take-home message here is that Rapid Lake imports about 2,500 pounds of fresh produce a week, which is, in my mind, very, very considerable. And it kind of changed my direction of where this project should go, because I was maybe a bit naive about the volumes involved. So that to me was staggering and eye-opening. But I mean, they are a small community basically, so you've got to look at it that way, right? So where did we go from here? Well, I knew that that was a lot of food, so I started designing or looking into different greenhouse types that might be possible. And I ended up with 3. This first one is just a small seasonal greenhouse, and that's just to show one side of the spectrum. The middle one is a Chinese style greenhouse. It's a lot larger. It can be anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 square feet. The design allows for a season extension, so the growing season in northern Saskatchewan is very short, it's about 4 months. And using this design, you can get it up to 8, 10 months of the year, which is very valuable for us. Then the third one is a polytunnel. This type has already been done in many places in northern Saskatchewan, where the environment outside is not so extreme. However, it's usually used as plastic, which is not as durable. It has to be replaced on average every 4 years, versus this middle one is using either glass or polycarbonate as opposed to polyethylene plastic. So it's this middle one is a lot more durable. Things last about 10 years on average, and it's a lot more hardy to the environment. So for those reasons, and I mean, they all have associated costs, obviously. You can get into a small, ready-to-move backyard greenhouse for less than $5,000. This gigantic number of $80,000, it seems very large, but this is the deluxe Cadillac of greenhouses that involves all of the internal instruments and stuff like that. So that would be the very high end. And then again, these smaller plastic ones, which are done quite often, are very cheap to get into. But for all the reasons that I discussed, being able to resist the external elements and having that longevity of 10 to 15 years, being able to incorporate external fuel sources and stuff like that, my focus as a researcher was to investigate this Chinese-style greenhouse because it has the most robust capabilities. So then I went on from there. So what is a Chinese-style greenhouse? What makes it Chinese, and why are we doing it in Canada? Well, there's a lot of parts or aspects of a Chinese greenhouse that are actually quite favorable to Canadian conditions, although they haven't been tried very often. Firstly, they have a very unique southern slope. You're probably used to seeing a European greenhouse where it's kind of a barn and every side of it is transparent glass or plastic. That does work well for intense growing, but when we talk about northern Saskatchewan and our 4 months of intense heat, it's going to overheat. So this angle of high incidence is good for high latitude greenhouses, and it actually keeps them cool in the summer and warmer in the winter. So that's a nice benefit. Then they have a heat absorbing north wall, so the sunlight comes through the south and ends up hitting this north wall, which is usually rammed earth or water, some kind of passive thermal reservoir, and it allows the heat to stay radiant throughout the day. Reflective versus transparent sidewalls. So again, we talked about the traditional European greenhouse, where the light's coming in and it's leaving through both sides of the greenhouse. There's no control there. So by only having one side of your greenhouse be transparent, the light comes in and then it stays in there and reflects, so you make the most out of your available sunlight, which we know is already limited in the north. And again, a higher level of insulation. So this is how they do it in China, which is, obviously that's not $80,000, and it can be done more economically, but their environment isn't as extreme. But there's only one transparent one side. So inside it will actually be all white walls, and the light will just bounce around and maximize in there. Oops, sorry. And again, these are, because only one side has to be transparent, a lot of times they'll be built into existing buildings or into the environment. So there's been a few cases of these where they're built into schools, on the side of schools, and they use the residual heat. And those are some of the ideas that we were running with here with Cameco's project. So some of the key findings. Suitable greenhouse locations, everything was based on consultation. So a well-lit, south-facing area with good drainage, easy access to existing water and power lines, close proximity to camp, relative distance from mine operations. So that was about, it should be close to camp in order to be perceived as healthy. And this is not an actual health claim. The entire mine site is it can be put anywhere. But the perception of health was higher near camp. And just going to go back here. So this is just a Google Earth image of the possible site and an actual picture of the site that we found that could fit a greenhouse of this size and have all those qualities. And below are a few of the conclusions I'll go through really quickly. So these were some of the ideas of the project and where I met them once I actually did the research and what I found out about those presumptions or the things that I thought. So one is that Rabbit Lake personnel, contractors and the like that we talked about were readily available, and this would make this project cheaper. Well, what I found out when talking to people was that existing contract frameworks actually make this about 30% more expensive, and this has to do with northern contracting companies, Athabasca, all of these contracting firms that have relationships with Cameco that need to be maintained, and this increased costs. Another presumption that we had was Rabbit Lake workers initiated the study, meaning they're totally game to volunteer and spend their time there. In actuality, I found out that many workers, they doubted that there would be adequate volunteer work. And this has to do with when do you want to be doing greenhousing? During the hot season, right? And during that time, people who are working the mines, they want to be out fishing and stuff like that. So it's kind of a double whammy that we need volunteers at this time, but they're also probably not available. Existing materials, fuel sources, and residual heat can greatly reduce the cost of an all-year greenhouse. So this is a fancy word, industrial symbiosis, but what it means is there's a big fancy mine that's been there for 25 years, there must be some waste heat, there must be some process that we're not using that can make a greenhouse profitable. And this is extremely true in everywhere you can go. You can put it next to a school, you can put it next to a mine, it's very true, but it's site dependent. So in this case, existing wood on site may provide 30% of the material, and in our case, it wasn't residual heat that seemed most profitable to pursue. It was residual oils. So oils that come out of the vehicles, out of the heavy equipment, out of the kitchen. We can actually reclaim those, and there was 83,000 that were basically given away last year. So we could have used that as a fuel source to power our greenhouse. However, the heat that's involved is only a marginal cost compared to the upfront 80,000 and all those other factors. So it wasn't an extreme, I would say, or a very beneficial environmental or financial motivator. So I know I'm kind of going over time, so I'm just going to hurry this up a little bit for you guys. There's a few more. Greenhousing will allow for a larger, more robust diet. Yes and no. Many crops, as I'm sure you're aware, beans, squash, and corn work well together. Many don't. I'd like to say that we could grow anything and everything in a mine greenhouse, but in actuality, certain things play together, certain things don't. So usually greenhouses have to take into account local markets. What do the people want? What can we do? So most common vegetables grown in Saskatchewan. Does anyone know? I have 3 up here. Carrots, potatoes, and lentils. I'm sorry we got 0 out of 3. They're actually tomatoes. They're tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers. And they're these 3 things because they're light hungry, they're heat hungry, they grow fast, and they produce high yields. So they're grown purely for profit. And most of the greenhousing data comes from these high yield vegetables. And as you can see at Rabbit Lake, they're actually a very low amount of what's being brought in. About all 3 of these combined is 7.4% and 12.3% in winter, so not that much. Versus most popular vegetables at Rabbit Lake were quite close to what you said: potatoes, carrots, and celery. So potatoes and carrots together are 25%. So one of my recommendations is that maybe a root greenhouse would be more preferable, but there are distinct disadvantages to root greenhouses. They require more soil, they require more work, and they have very low yields in comparison to these light hungry crops. So very quickly, what are my recommendations? Based on this research, it was deemed that an all-year food production greenhouse is unfortunately not feasible at Cameco's Rabbit Lake operation at this time. That being said, it was based on cost-benefit analysis of economic and environmental challenges at this time, and it may still be very viable in the future. Certain greenhousing options, herb gardens, etc., are of course feasible at a low cost. And community-based greenhouses versus industrial greenhouses are an alternate strategy. So I did, in my research, meet a lot of people that are pursuing these community-based greenhouses in northern Saskatchewan. Murray Gray is one guy who has an agriculture degree from U of S, and he's putting up the polytunnel greenhouses in, I think, 4 locations around Saskatchewan. There's one in Bigger, Cumberland House, there's one in Isle Cross, and there's one in Nipawin, and there's more coming. So this all represents a very serious alternate strategy that northern mines can use to decrease the distance that food travels. And you can't ask any questions, so I'm sorry.